Superman is a movie I've been waiting for a very long time. As a kid, I loved the DC characters. In fact, arguably, I thought as a kid that they had the way stronger lineup when compared to Marvel. However, I've always been frustrated with the way DC has been handled on film. Whether it be Snyder deciding to make all of the characters more godlike and morose, which I was never really a fan of, or the kind of mess of the period in between then when they tried to have like The Rock take over the universe for a bit as Black Adam. I always just found that they squandered what is, in my opinion, one of the greatest lineup of heroes you could possibly hope for as a studio. And Warner Brothers always had the benefit of having all their characters from the jump. They didn't have to rely on the B and C tier characters that Marvel had to rely on to build what has now become a cinematic empire. So when it was announced a couple of years ago that James Gunn would be rebooting the DC film universe, I was incredibly excited. I really like James Gunn's work. I really like his work on the Guardians of the Galaxy movies, and I always thought that this could be the opportunity for us to get a version of this franchise and a version of Superman specifically who was more faithful to the original comic interpretation. And I'm pleased to say that Superman delivers on that. Superman to me is a farm dork who just so happens to be the most powerful guy in the universe, but he doesn't really think of himself in that way. He thinks of himself as a gifted guy who just wants to help people. And it was so refreshing to finally see that perspective on the big screen. Don't get me wrong, that perspective has been shown before. If you haven't seen it, I would highly recommend Superman and Lois. If you want a more down-to-earth Superman story that really kind of delves into his family life when he's a bit older. But this is the first time we are seeing that in cinemas, probably since the original Christopher Reeve movies way back in the 70s and 80s. Superman is not a perfect film. It has some pacing issues here and there. I also think that the sheer amount of characters, whilst I like all of them, does lead to some characters not getting the focus I would have liked them to get in a Superman film. Ironically, you don't see that much of Clark Kent. Most of the film, he is Superman. Equally, I would have liked to have seen more of the Daily Planet kind of cast than we got to see. However, this film to me delivers on all the fundamentals you would want out of a modern Superman interpretation. Superman is not a character who cares for political implications or optics. He is a guy who fundamentally just wants to preserve life by all means possible. In some ways, that's quite naive, but that's kind of the joy of Superman. He's a character who has an old-fashioned sense of justice and morality in a world that's getting increasingly more complex. He's a lot like Captain America in that sense. And this film demonstrates that perfectly, whether it be from scenes where he stops mid-battle to save a squirrel from being attacked, or whether it's to do with the more kind of politically charged aspect of this film, the conflict between the two fictional countries of Bavaria and Jahanpur. Bavaria being an American ally, but one that seems to be violently suppressing the people of Jahanpur, which I'm sure has no real-world implications whatsoever. And of course, Superman going against the more aggressive American ally is seen as like a big betrayal by the American media and something he gets a lot of flack for, but he doesn't care because to him, what's important is people were going to die. There's a whole conflict between him and Lois at the beginning of the film that demonstrates this perfectly. He is a man who, at his core, believes in life and humanity and the preservation of that at all costs. So, Superman, characterization-wise, is perfect. I also love his dynamic with Lois Lane. Lois Lane is one of the most important characters in comic books. She is the superhero love interest. And while she doesn't get quite as much time as I would have liked, what we do see of her is really, really strong. She's incredibly confident, more so than Clark is, incredibly good at journalism, and also more cynical than Clark, but also because Clark is so pure, that's what makes her so in love with him. And the chemistry between David Corenswet and Rachel Brosnahan is insane. They almost look like they've been married for 10 years. Like, they have such a instant connection between the two of them, and it's wonderful to watch. In terms of other elements of this film, you have the newly introduced Justice Gang, who are a group of superheroes that are largely funded by a corporation. And while they don't really dabble on that too much, I imagine that's going to be expanded in future films. But I did like their utilization, how they're more so just focused on getting the job done and not really caring about how. For example, when a giant kaiju is attacking Metropolis and Superman is trying to save it and, make sure it survives, the Justice Gang have no qualms in killing it in order to neutralize the threat. And I think that they act as a great contrast to Superman. The Justice Gang are a bunch of corporately sponsored superheroes. Meanwhile, you have Superman, who does it purely out of a desire to do good and nothing more. All of the characters are really fun as well. As I said, there isn't really a character I dislike in this movie. Quite the contrary. I enjoy all of them whenever they come up. Mr. Terrific and Guy Gardner in particular are huge highlights for me. Something that I do find interesting is that they don't really spend a lot of time really explaining how their powers work. It kind of just is taken as read that you understand the concept of a Green Lantern or just Mr. Terrific in general. And while I can imagine that being somewhat alienating for casuals, I also just appreciated that this movie just embraces the fact that it takes place in a living, breathing comic book universe and doesn't feel the need to justify its existence as a comic book film. One of the things that kind of bothers me about more recent comic book adaptations is that they'll adapt things from the comics, but then kind of do this thing where they snidely make fun of the things in the comics. Can you believe how stupid this is? For example, the scene I always think of is the scene in No Way Home, which is a film I do really like, where Peter Parker makes fun of the name Dr. Otto Octavius. Which, I get it, it is a dumb name, but I really appreciate this movie just earnestly translating everything in the comics on screen and not feeling the need to justify that. Just embracing that this is the DC Universe, this is Superman. Yes, he wears a big pair of underwear on the front of his suit, deal with it. And I really appreciate that. I think this movie has a really great balance between comedic and darker moments. I would say that it's less comedic and less funny than James Gunn's Guardians of the Galaxy movies, but I think that that's justified because it has more moments that are quite real and down to earth. For example, as I mentioned, the fictional conflict between those two countries and the child who is screaming out for Superman's help when he thinks he's going to die. The film has moments of levity, but also when it wants to take itself seriously and serious things are happening, it treats them with the appropriate level of severity. What little we do see of the rest of Superman's cast, I do really like as well though. Jimmy Olsen is really fun, and I like that he is just an absolute Giga Chad who seems to have all women fall desperately in love with him all the time, which actually does have relevance later on. Metamorpho is a really cool kind of visual and kind of reflection of the comics. However, there isn't an awful lot to him. However, I do like his desire to make sure his baby Joey stays safe. As you can probably tell, there's a lot going on in this movie, and I haven't even got to the villain of the piece, which is arguably my favourite part of the film, Nicholas Hoult as Lex Luthor. I've liked Nicholas Hoult for quite some time. One of my favourite TV shows in recent years is The Great, which is kind of a fictionalised historical comedy about Catherine the Great, in which he plays Emperor Peter. And he's really fun in that. And in this, he plays Lex in a way that I've always wanted to see Lex portrayed, but never had. He plays Lex as a complete petty arsehole, and that is exactly what Lex is supposed to be. Lex is incredibly intelligent, but is so single-minded and solely focused on Superman's destruction that he lets other things kind of cloud his judgment. A scene I absolutely adore in this movie is when he is instructing Ultraman to just keep wailing on Superman, and he just keeps screaming, 1A, 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 which is obviously one of the moves that he's pre-programmed into Ultraman. And he says it in such a way that just makes it feel like he wants to be the one delivering those punches. Lex in this movie is also just really genuinely evil. He shoots a guy right in front of Superman, steals Superman's dog, and is fully prepared to let an entire city fall into a universal rift and, quote, he only cares about stopping it when it gets to somewhere he cares about. He is, like, the perfect balance of completely irredeemably evil, but also you understand that there's a little bit more going on under the surface than he's letting on. Lex, for me, is one of the absolute highlights of the film. I think he's probably one of my favourite aspects. And the fact that, like, whenever his girlfriends annoy him or do something he doesn't like, he traps them in a parallel universe is just so petty and perfect for Lex as a character. I think you can probably tell by how much I'm jumping around in this review that there is a lot going on in this movie, and I think that's one of my main criticisms of it, is as much as I really enjoyed it, and I really enjoyed the spectacle and all these different moments, I think that the fact that there's so much going on is sometimes to its detriment. I would have liked a few more scenes of just quiet moments of reflection in this movie. For example, one of my favourite scenes in this movie is the scene towards the end where Superman is sort of defeated, you know, he has been severely beaten up, which actually is another thing I really like about this movie. Superman gets beaten up by a lot of different people, which kind of dispels this myth that Superman isn't interesting because he's all-powerful, which I've never really believed anyway. But it's just a bit where Clark Kent is telling him, you are the decisions that you make. You're not defined by who came before you. It's a really, really nice scene, which also leads me into probably one of the biggest changes and controversies surrounding this film, and that is the change to Superman's original parents and their motivation for sending him to Earth. In most adaptations, Jor-El and Lara L's kind of motivations for sending Superman to Earth is largely just because Krypton's about to be destroyed and they want him to survive, and they specifically send him to Earth with the expressed purpose of doing good for the planet. They're a less developed planet in their own words, and they send him there specifically so that he can help people. In this version, it's slightly different. Initially, when you first hear Jor-El and Lara speak, it seems like that's the exact same thing that they want for this film, but it is later revealed through Lex Luthor that in fact there is a second part of the message that Clark never heard, where it's revealed that what Jor-El and Lara actually wanted was for Superman or for Kal-El to do is to go down to Earth and basically subjugate humanity, because he is a superior being, he's a Kryptonian. And this is controversial, obviously, for a lot of people who like Jor-El and Lara, because they prefer the idea that they were good people who just wanted the best for their son, which I can completely understand. For me, though, this worked, because the way I saw it was, it allows for Superman's desire to help humanity not just come from a purpose given to him by his parents when he was a baby, but instead come from himself and his own actions. And it also increases the importance of the Kents, who I really love in this movie, and I really love the message at the end when he says, play the clip of my parents, and he plays clips of them. It kind of makes Superman into a more of a found family kind of story, which I actually think worked, and I imagine will resonate with a lot of people. I understand why some people won't like the change made to Superman's parents, but for me, I think it works. I think it makes Superman's decision to be a good person more impactful. I think it works. I liked that as a change. There's other minor things I can talk about, like, for example, the fact that they reveal that Superman's glasses are hypno glasses, which is how no one figures out that Clark Kent and Superman are the same guy, which is actually in the comics, which I like fine as a change. But the other thing I would be remiss not to talk about before ending this review is Krypto. Krypto is great in this movie. The decision to make him kind of an unruly dog who Superman just has to try and care for while his cousin is away is such a fun dynamic, and you really see their bond evolve through the movie. It's the bit where Clark says, he's just a dog. He's not even a very good one, but right now he's scared and alone. And I just think that is Superman. That is Superman at his core. That is exactly what he would say. That's exactly what he believes. And I just really love the way that he's portrayed. Obviously, he was apparently based upon James Gunn's own dog. I think his name is Ozu, who's kind of a mischievous dog. And I definitely saw parallels between Krypto and my own dog, who's kind of mischievous and loves chaos. And I can imagine that if my dog had superpowers, that's exactly how they would act. And I thought he was really, really cute. and really, really fun. And I think a lot of people who maybe haven't seen many superhero movies or are not normally that into superhero movies probably are going to love Krypto and think that he's the cutest thing ever. The other major twist in this movie is that the previously mentioned Ultraman is in fact a clone of Superman that Lex has made. I assume that this is set up for him to become Bizarro in some capacity. And in terms of the future of the universe, we get an ending scene where, as I said before, Supergirl appears to go and collect her dog Krypto. And just recently, at time of recording this, James Gunn has posted the first poster for the Supergirl movie with the caption "Look Out" instead of the caption of Superman the movie, which is "Look Up." Obviously, kind of hinting towards Supergirl having a much less kind of solid upbringing that Clark got. Obviously, Krypton in the original comics exploded when she was 13 years old, so she kind of was more aware of what was happening than Superman was. Obviously, Krypton exploded when Superman was a baby, so he doesn't really remember it. And of course, she is, in the movie, established as, partying on, planets with red suns and all this kind of stuff. So Supergirl seems to be more of a mess than Clark is, and I really like that they've taken that direction rather than just making her female Clark Kent. I think that would be much less interesting, and I'm really optimistic for Supergirl next year. But I think my overall thesis for this video and kind of this movie is that Superman is the movie that we all needed it to be in the 2020s. In a period of division and controversy and just people becoming more vicious and kind of more hostile than they've ever been before, having a movie that contains a hero that isn't morally grey or isn't, vengeful or angry, but is someone who just earnestly believes in the preservation of life at all costs and believes in the idea of being kind as the ultimate goal, is something that I just found really refreshing, especially after years of dark Superman interpretations. Whether it be Zack Snyder's own Superman being a more stoic god figure who was kind of detached from humanity, or whether it be characters like Homelander, who, don't get me wrong, I love, but obviously is playing on the idea that a hopeful kind of optimistic American hero is kind of an outdated premise that probably wouldn't exist in the real world. But it was nice to see that actually portrayed. And, the idea of a hopeful hero can work and can resonate in the modern day. And obviously, this movie seems to be doing very well at the box office. I know that there's a whole kind of controversy around this movie because the Snyder people keep saying it's a flop. But, frankly, I don't see any evidence of that yet. It seems to be having multiple record-breaking days domestically. Internationally, it's doing less well, but I think it's worth considering there that, people aren't exactly, enamored with America at the moment, and a very American superhero like Superman is probably not going to do that well, especially in markets like China. I feel like that's something that people aren't considering when they talk about the international kind of box office take of Superman. And I don't think that'll just be exclusive to Superman either. I think that will apply to Fantastic Four, and it definitely applied to the recently released Captain America Brave New World as well. Obviously, time will tell, but I'm incredibly optimistic for the future of this new DC universe. I think David Corenswet is a great new Superman. I think he has the potential to be an all-timer Superman. Right now, I'd still say Christopher Reeve is my favourite cinematic Superman, but I would say Corenswet is probably already second, and I think I just need to see a bit more of him before I can definitively, give him the crown. But whatever your thoughts are on this movie, let me know down in the comments below. Be sure to like this video if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new because I don't use this channel as often as I should, and I'm planning on using it more, and I'll see you later.